The air in the showroom at Green Valley Implement was thick with the smell of new paint, fresh rubber, and the faint, clean scent of manufacturing oil. It was the smell of progress, the smell of 1972, and at the center of it all, parked on a polished concrete floor under a dozen fluorescent lights, sat the reason for the buzz that filled the cavernous steel building. A John Deere 6600 combine. It wasn't just a machine, it was a monument. The green paint was so deep you felt you could dive into it. The iconic yellow decals were sharp and perfect. The tires were black mountains of tread that had never touched dirt. In the cab, a throne of plush vinyl awaited its king, surrounded by a panorama of glass, a fortress against the dust and heat of a Midwestern harvest. Farmers from 3 counties stood around it, hands in their pockets, heads tilted back. They spoke in low, reverent tones, the way men do around things that represent both a dream and a terrifying financial commitment. They talked about the 135 horsepower diesel engine, the 20-foot grain head, the sheer, unadulterated capacity of it. It could swallow a field of corn whole and spit out clean, golden kernels faster than any 2 machines they were currently running. Frank Miller stood off to the side, near the parts counter, a cracked V-belt clutched in his grease-stained hand. He wasn't looking at the new 6600. His eyes were fixed on the bins of bolts and bearings behind the counter, his mind calculating the stress and wear on a machine that was born the same year as his oldest daughter. He felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on him, but he didn't look up. He knew what they were thinking. There was Frank Miller, trying to hold his farm together with baling wire and stubbornness, while the rest of the world was moving on. His combine was a Massey Ferguson 300, a 1959 model his father had bought used. It was an open-station machine with a gutless little Continental gas engine that you had to coax to life on cold mornings. It had a 12-foot grain platform and a 2-row corn head that felt ancient compared to the 6-row monster on the showroom floor. But Frank knew every inch of that Massey. He knew the peculiar whine the variable speed drive made when it was under a heavy load, the exact tension the cylinder drive belt needed to avoid slipping, the specific sequence of levers to engage to keep from killing the engine. It was his. Every nut, every bolt was paid for. That meant something. It meant everything. The crowd around the new combine parted, and Richard Peterson strode through like a conquering hero. Rich was all smiles and confidence, his brand-new work boots still unscuffed, his checkbook practically humming in his pocket. He clapped the dealership owner, Old Man Hemlock, on the back. "Well, she's a beauty, Bill, a real beauty," Rich boomed, his voice echoing slightly in the big building. "Time to stop playing in the dirt and start farming for real." Hemlock grinned, rubbing his hands together. "She'll do the work of 3 machines, Rich. You'll have your crops in before your neighbors even get started." Rich's eyes scanned the room, soaking in the envy and admiration. Then they landed on Frank, standing alone at the parts counter. A slow, condescending smirk spread across his face. He sauntered over, his boots clicking on the concrete. "Morning, Frank," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Picking up some spare parts for that museum piece of yours?" Frank turned slowly, his face impassive. He held up the worn belt. Cylinder belt, the old one starting to look a little thin. Rich chuckled, shaking his head. "Still trying to patch that thing up? A man can't get ahead with yesterday's tools, Frank. You know that. Look at this." He gestured back at the gleaming 6600. Air conditioning, hydrostatic drive, monitors that tell you everything but your wife's mood. That's efficiency. That's the future. Frank looked from Rich's clean hands to his own. The black grease worked deep into the lines of his knuckles. "She runs," he said, his voice low and steady. "And she's paid for." The words hung in the air, a quiet challenge to the spectacle of credit and progress dominating the room. Rich just laughed it off. "Paid for doesn't put more bushels in the bin, Frank. You got to spend money to make money. That's the first rule of modern farming. The Farmer's Home Administration is practically giving money away. You're leaving a fortune on the table, clinging to that old relic." A few of the other farmers nodded in agreement. Rich was right. The times were changing. Grain prices were ticking up. Land was available if you were bold enough to take the loan. And the government was backing farmers who wanted to expand. Frank's cautious, debt-free approach seemed like a relic itself, a dusty philosophy from his father's generation. Frank just gave a slight nod, turning back to the parts counter. The kid behind the desk finally found the right belt, pulling a dusty sleeve from a high shelf. "That'll be $6.40, the kid said. Frank pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket, counted out the exact change, and took the new belt. As he turned to leave, Rich called out one last time, "Don't come crying to me when you're still out there in the dust come Thanksgiving, Frank. I'll be done by Halloween and on my way to Florida." The showroom erupted in polite laughter. Frank didn't look back. He just pushed the heavy glass door open and walked out into the bright autumn sunlight, the new belt in his hand feeling like a small, solitary victory in a war he seemed to be losing. He climbed into his old Ford F-250, the engine turning over with a familiar, rumbling cough. As he drove away, the reflection of the giant green combine shimmered in his rearview mirror, a vision of a future he wasn't sure he wanted or could even afford. Now, before we get too deep into this story, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever known a man like Frank, the kind of fella who'd rather wrench on old iron he owns outright than sign a note for something new and shiny? The man who values a paid-for receipt more than a bigger yield financed by the bank? Let me know down in the comments, because that's the kind of man this story is all about. And understanding him is the key to understanding everything that happened next. The harvest of 1972 started under a sky the color of a faded blueprint. A high, thin layer of clouds did little to blunt the sun's late-season intensity. Across the county, you could hear the roar of new diesels coming to life. Rich Peterson was first in the field, of course. His John Deere 6600, fitted with a brand-new 6-row corn head, moved through his northernmost section like a battleship cresting a golden ocean. The sound of it was a deep, throaty growl, a confident assertion of power. From his fence line a mile away, Frank could see the steady plume of dust and chaff rising behind it, a testament to its relentless pace. Frank, meanwhile, was coaxing his Massey 300 to life. The Continental 6-cylinder gas engine was cold-blooded. It took a little choke, a little patience, and a careful feathering of the throttle before it settled into its lumpy, off-beat idle. It didn't roar. It chattered. The sound was a collection of mechanical noises, the rattle of the shaker pan, the hum of the belts, the clatter of the gathering chains, all layered over the engine's uneven breathing. There was no cab. Frank sat on a simple steel seat, the steering wheel in front of him, a constellation of levers at his right hand. The dust was his co-pilot. He eased the old combine into the first 2 rows of corn. The stalks popped and cracked as the gathering chains pulled them into the snapping rolls. The machine shuddered as the ears were ripped from the stalks and conveyed up into the cylinder. Frank watched and listened, his entire body an extension of the machine. He could feel the load on the engine through the vibration in the seat. He could hear the cylinder speed change with the volume of material passing through it. He wasn't driving a machine so much as wearing it. For 3 days it went like this. Frank would run from sunup until the dew got too heavy at night. He'd come home caked in a layer of grime, his ears ringing, his muscles aching from the constant vibration and the manual wrestling of the controls. He was making progress, slowly but surely. The grain tank on the Massey was small, only about 60 bushels, so he had to unload frequently into his old grain truck. Each evening, he'd spend an hour with a grease gun and an air hose, blowing the dust off the engine and hitting every zerk, checking the belts, looking for any sign of trouble. The trouble found him on the 4th day. He was on the far side of his 80-acre home place, the field bordered by a thick stand of woods. The sun was high and hot. He'd just started a new pass when he heard it. Not a bang, but a sharp, metallic screech, followed by a sickening grinding sound and a sudden, violent shudder that nearly threw him from the seat. He killed the engine instantly. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the hot manifold and the buzz of insects in the corn. The smell hit him next, the acrid stench of burnt metal. Frank slid off the seat, his heart sinking into the pit of his stomach. He knew that sound. He knew that smell. He crawled under the machine, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. There it was. The main bearing on the cylinder shaft had seized. The outer race had disintegrated, and the shaft had gouged a deep groove into its housing. It was bad. It was a harvest-ending kind of bad. He sat back in the dirt, the dry soil cool against his worn overalls. He looked across the road. In the distance, he could see the steady, uninterrupted progress of Rich Peterson's 6600, still eating its way through another field. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over him. Maybe Rich was right. Maybe he was a fool. But the feeling lasted only a moment, replaced by the familiar, stubborn grit that had been hammered into him by years of farming. Despair wouldn't fix a bearing. He walked back to the house, told his wife, Mary, what had happened, and got into his pickup. He didn't drive to the Massey Ferguson dealer. They wouldn't have a part for a machine that old, and if they did, they'd charge a fortune for it. Instead, he drove to his shed. His machine shed was his sanctuary. It was organized with a farmer's logic, where tools were hung not by size or type, but by frequency of use. He pulled the worn, grease-smudged service manual for the Massey 300 from a metal cabinet. He flipped through the brittle, yellowed pages until he found the exploded diagram of the cylinder assembly. He studied it for a long time, tracing the lines with a calloused finger, memorizing the order of disassembly. The next 2 days were a blur of brute force and mechanical finesse. He drove his old Farmall M tractor out to the field and used a heavy log chain to drag the crippled combine back to the shed. Getting the cylinder out was the worst part. It was a massive, heavy drum of steel bars, buried deep in the guts of the machine. He had to use a chain hoist rigged to a roof beam, a collection of pry bars, and every curse word he knew. The air in the shed grew thick with the smell of penetrating oil and sweat. He worked until his knuckles were raw and his back screamed in protest. He finally got the shaft out and onto his workbench. The bearing was completely destroyed, welded to the shaft by heat and friction. He had to use a cutting torch to carefully slice it off without damaging the shaft itself. Then came the search. He took the old bearing's measurements and the part number from the manual and started making calls. The implement dealers were a dead end. The auto parts stores just laughed. Finally, he found a specialty bearing and supply house in the city, an hour's drive away. An old man with a gravelly voice answered the phone. "Yeah, I think I know the one you're talking about," the man said after Frank read him the number. "Haven't seen one of those in 20 years. Let me look in the back." Frank waited, the phone cord wrapped tight around his fist. He could hear the man rummaging around, the sound of heavy boxes being moved. After what felt like an eternity, the man came back on the line. "You're in luck. Found one. Sitting on a shelf in a box full of old new departure parts. It's yours if you want it." $15. Frank felt a surge of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees. "I'll be there in an hour," he said. While he was gone, Rich Peterson drove by. He slowed his shiny new pickup to a crawl, peering into the open doors of Frank's shed, where the Massey sat in a state of partial disassembly, its insides looking like a mechanical autopsy. Rich shook his head with a pitying smirk and drove on. Later that day, Frank's neighbor, Charlie, stopped by. "Heard you had a breakdown, Frank," Charlie said, leaning against the doorframe. "That's tough. You know, Rich finished that whole north section today. Said his yield monitor was showing over 150 bushels to the acre." He paused, looking at the mess of parts on the floor. "You sure you don't want to just call the scrap man for this thing? You're losing money every day she sits here." "I'll get her going," Frank said, his voice tight. He didn't need the reminder. The weather forecast on the radio was calling for a chance of rain in 3 days. Every hour counted. By the time he got back with the new bearing, it was already dark. He worked late into the night, the shed illuminated by a single bare bulb. He carefully pressed the new bearing onto the shaft, packed it with grease, and began the painstaking process of putting everything back together. It was slow, frustrating work. A bolt would strip, a plate wouldn't line up, but he kept at it, his movements deliberate and sure. This was his penance for thrift, his trial by iron, and he would not fail. 2.5 days after the breakdown, Frank fired up the Massey. The Continental engine coughed to life, and the whole machine settled into its familiar, clattering rhythm. The terrible grinding noise was gone, replaced by the smooth, whirring hum of a new, well-greased bearing. Frank engaged the separator and listened. It sounded right. It sounded strong. He backed it out of the shed and headed for the field, the sun just beginning to dip toward the horizon. He had lost time, but he hadn't lost the harvest. He got his crop in, finishing the last pass just as the first cold drops of a late autumn rain began to fall. His final yield wasn't a record breaker, but it was solid. His total cost for the repair was $15 for the bearing, a tank of gas to drive to the city, and 3 days of sweat and busted knuckles. He'd take that trade any day. The next few years were like a fever dream for farmers in the heartland. The early 1970s brought a boom the likes of which no one had ever seen. In 1973, the Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest of their own, secretly negotiated a massive purchase of American grain. The deal, which came to be known as the Great Grain Robbery, sent commodity prices into the stratosphere overnight. Corn, which had been hovering around $1 a bushel, suddenly shot past $3. Soybeans went from $3 to over $10. It was like a gusher of black gold had been struck right in the middle of every cornfield in Iowa. The government, led by Agriculture Secretary Earl Butz, fanned the flames, telling farmers to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. Get big or get out, was the mantra. The banks, flush with cash and eager to lend, practically begged farmers to take on more debt. Land values exploded, doubling and then tripling in just a few short years. It felt like the good times were here to stay, a permanent new era of prosperity. No one rode that wave higher than Rich Peterson. The profits from his 72 and 73 crops were staggering, but instead of banking the money, he saw it as seed for an even bigger empire. He used his newfound wealth as collateral to borrow more, much more. He bought the 160-acre farm that bordered Frank's property to the west. He bought another 240 acres south of town. He was farming nearly 1,000 acres now, a massive operation for the time. His machinery stable grew to match his acreage. The John Deere 6600, not even 2 years old, was traded in for the new king of the harvest, a brand new 7700 turbo, the biggest, most powerful combine John Deere had ever built. Its grain tank held nearly 200 bushels, and its diesel engine put out a thunderous 150 horsepower. To pull his massive new planter and chisel plough, he bought a monstrous John Deere 80R630, articulated four-wheel drive tractor, a green beast with 8 giant tires, and a price tag that could have bought a nice house in town. Rich Peterson wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was an agricultural tycoon, the undisputed king of the county. The local newspaper did a feature story on him, complete with a picture of him standing in front of his fleet of new green machines, his arms crossed, a confident smile on his face. The headline read, "The Face of Modern Farming." Frank Miller, meanwhile, was the face of something else entirely. He, too, benefited from the soaring grain prices. The profits from his modest 240 acres in 73 and 74 were more money than he had ever seen in his life. But his reaction was the polar opposite of Rich's. The first thing he did was pay off the last remaining note on his operating loan at the bank. The feeling of signing that final check, of truly owning his operation free and clear, was a deeper satisfaction than any new machine could provide. With the rest of the money, he didn't buy more land. He didn't buy new equipment. He built a new, larger machine shed, a solid pole barn with a concrete floor and good wiring, a proper place to work on his iron. He bought a new Lincoln stick welder and a heavy-duty drill press. He replaced the leaky roof on his barn and put a down payment on a small college fund for his kids. The rest of it, a substantial sum, he put into conservative savings bonds at the bank. He kept running the same equipment, the old Massey 300 combine, the reliable John Deere 4010, and the steadfast Farmall M his father had bought new in 1951. He kept them in immaculate condition. In the new shed, he had the space to do proper maintenance. In the off-season, he'd perform complete tear-downs, replacing worn parts, repainting rusted spots, keeping the old machines in peak running order. To the rest of the community, he was an enigma, a fool who was squandering the opportunity of a lifetime. The talk at the co-op was merciless. "Can you believe Frank Miller?" they'd say, shaking their heads. "Sitting on a pile of cash from $3 corn, and he's still out there choking on dust in that old Massey. He could have leveraged that money, bought the Henderson place when it came up for sale. He could be farming 500 acres by now." They saw his discipline as a lack of vision. His caution was mistaken for cowardice. In an era of explosive growth and easy credit, the man who refused to take on debt was seen not as wise, but as a failure, a man afraid to play the game. Even Mary, his wife, sometimes looked at the brand-new house the Petersons were building on the hill and wondered if Frank wasn't being a little too stubborn. Frank felt the judgment, but it didn't move him. He had a deep, abiding distrust of things that seemed too good to be true. He remembered his father's stories of the Depression, of neighbors who had lost everything because they'd overextended themselves in the good times of the 20s. "Debt is a leash," his father used to say. "The longer it is, the more you think you're free, right up until it chokes you." One afternoon, in the fall of 1975, Frank was at the bank depositing a check when he overheard his loan officer, a young man named Bill, talking to Rich Peterson. Rich was applying for yet another loan, this time to build a massive grain drying and storage facility on his property. "The rates are still good, Rich," Bill was saying, "but I have to advise you, this will be a variable rate loan. The Fed is getting real nervous about inflation. There's talk they might start tightening things up." Rich just laughed, a big booming sound that filled the small office. Inflation is my best friend, Billy. It makes my land worth more every day, and I get to pay you back with cheaper dollars. Don't you worry about me. Just draw up the papers." Frank finished his transaction and walked out, the conversation echoing in his mind. Variable rate, inflation. The words felt like distant thunder on a hot summer day. That evening, after the chores were done, he sat in his machine shed, the quiet hum of the radio his only company. He was meticulously cleaning and oiling the gathering chains on his Massey's corn head, getting it ready for the coming harvest. A news report came on, the announcer's voice grave. He talked about the OPEC oil embargo, about gas lines, about the consumer price index hitting double digits. He mentioned the Federal Reserve chairman by name, talking about his vow to whip inflation, no matter the cost. A cold breeze rustled the leaves of the big oak tree outside the open shed door. Frank paused, a grease-covered rag in his hand. He looked at his old combine, its simple, rugged mechanics laid bare under the single light bulb. It was slow. It was uncomfortable. It was obsolete. But it was his. It owed nothing to any bank, and it asked for nothing but grease, fuel, and a patient hand at the controls. A storm was coming. Everyone else was still celebrating the sunshine, buying bigger boats to enjoy the calm seas. Frank, alone in his shed, was checking the soundness of his hull and battening down the hatches. He didn't know when the storm would hit or how bad it would be. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it was coming. The year was 1979, and the golden age was beginning to tarnish. The signs were subtle at first, like the first yellowing leaf on a healthy oak. The price of diesel fuel, which had seemed a minor expense just a few years earlier, nearly doubled. The cost of fertilizer, tied directly to natural gas, went right along with it. At the co-op, the easy credit of the mid-70s was tightening. The manager, who used to greet farmers with a signed blank ticket, now looked over their accounts with a pinched expression before letting them charge a tank of fuel. The talk in the coffee shop was changing too. The boisterous bragging about land prices and new equipment was replaced by a low grumble about input costs and the stubborn way commodity prices refused to keep pace. That autumn, a hard, dry wind blew out of the southwest for 3 solid weeks, sucking the last bit of moisture from the topsoil. The corn leaves curled in on themselves, a thirsty, desperate gesture. Yields were down across the county, not disastrously, but enough to make a man with a heavy debt load break into a cold sweat in the middle of the night. Rich Peterson felt that sweat. He was running harder than ever, trying to outrun his balance sheet. His massive John Deere 8630 tractor burned through 100 gallons of high-priced diesel in a 10-hour day. The payments on his machinery, his land, and his new grain setup were a relentless, crushing weight, due on the 1st of every month whether it rained or not. His easy confidence had been replaced with a brittle, defensive arrogance. The breaking point came in the middle of the soybean harvest. Rich was running his magnificent John Deere 7700 Turbo, the cab a sealed, air-conditioned bubble of technology against the outside world. He was pushing it hard, trying to get the beans out before the pods started to shatter in the dry wind. Suddenly, a high-pitched alarm screamed from the console. A red light flashed next to a symbol he didn't recognize. The hydrostatic transmission, the complex marvel that gave the machine its smooth, effortless control, went into neutral. The 2-year-old $50,000 combine coasted to a dead stop in the middle of the field, its engine still roaring uselessly. Rich slammed his fist on the steering wheel. He fiddled with the controls, shut the machine down and restarted it. But it was no use. The combine would not move. This wasn't a broken belt he could replace, or a bearing he could grease. It was a problem buried deep in the machine's sophisticated electronic and hydraulic nervous system. He got on the two-way radio, his voice tight with fury, and called the dealership. It took the service technician, a young man with a laptop computer in a hardened case, 3 hours to get there. He plugged a thick cable into a port under the console and stared at the screen. After 20 minutes of diagnostic tests, he delivered the verdict. "It's the electronic displacement control module for the hydraulic pump," he said, as if describing a faulty toaster. "It's fried." "Well, replace it," Rich snapped. The technician shook his head slowly. "Don't have one on the truck. Don't even have one at the shop. It'll have to come out of the regional parts depot in Moline. Might get it here by tomorrow afternoon, if we're lucky." "Tomorrow afternoon?" Rich bellowed, the sound muffled by the cab's thick glass. "There's a storm front coming through in 2 days. I've got 400 acres of beans left to cut." The technician just shrugged. "Nothing I can do." He started writing up the work order. The part itself is $980, plus the service call and the labor to install it. You'll be looking at around $1,500. Rich stared out the panoramic window at his dying crop, the figure echoing in the silent cab. $1,500. It was 100 times what Frank Miller had spent to fix his entire combine. And for $1,500, he was buying nothing but 2 days of sitting still, 2 days of watching his profits wither on the stalk while the clouds gathered on the horizon. The first deep crack had appeared in the foundation of his empire, and through it he could feel a cold, terrifying draft. Frank heard about Rich's breakdown from his neighbor, Charlie. He was out in his own soybean field, chugging along with the old Massey 300. He had swapped the corn head for the 12-foot grain platform, a simple, purely mechanical affair with a sickle bar and a rotating reel. The dust was thick, coating his face and arms in a fine brown powder. The sun beat down on his neck, but the machine ran. When he heard a new squeak, he'd stop, grab his grease gun, find the offending zerk, and the squeak would go away. His biggest worry was a broken sickle section, a $3 part he could replace in 10 minutes with a hammer and a punch. He finished his last field the evening before the rain began to fall, his beans safely in the bin. His bins were paid for. The grain inside was his, clear and free, a bulwark against the coming storm. The storm that came wasn't made of wind and rain. It was a silent, invisible hurricane of economic policy that ripped through the American heartland with more destructive force than any tornado. Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, declared all-out war on inflation. He jacked up the prime interest rate, the rate banks charge their best customers. It climbed from the single digits to 12%, then 15%, then a terrifying, unbelievable 21.5%. For farmers like Rich Peterson, who had built their operations on a mountain of variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. The friendly letters from the bank were replaced by stark, formal notices. His monthly payments didn't just increase, they exploded. The loan on his new grain bins, the one he had laughed about, more than doubled. Suddenly, the cash flow from a harvest that was already weakened by drought and low prices wasn't enough to cover the interest, let alone the principal. Commodity prices collapsed. A grain embargo against the Soviet Union, imposed in response to the invasion of Afghanistan, slammed the door on a major export market. The price of corn fell back toward $2. Soybeans plummeted. At the same time, land values, which had been the bedrock of farm credit, began to crumble. The speculative bubble burst. Land that had been appraised at $2,000 an acre in 1979 was suddenly worth less than $1,000 by 1982. Rich was trapped. He was upside down. He owed the bank more than the total value of his land, his equipment, and his house combined. He tried to reason with the loan officer, the same man who had once encouraged him to borrow more. But the man's face was a mask of grim necessity. "My hands are tied, Rich," he said, refusing to meet his eyes. "The regulators are all over us. We have to call the note." The news spread through the county like a disease. The Peterson farm was in foreclosure. An auction was scheduled for a cold, grey Saturday in November of 1983. It wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. All over the Midwest, the same scene was playing out. The sounds of the auctioneer's chant became the funeral dirge for a generation of farmers who had believed the promise of "get big or get out." Frank Miller survived. His lack of debt was like an ark in the flood. The low prices hurt, but his costs were so low he could still scrape by. He didn't need to sell his grain into the collapsed market. He could afford to store it and wait. His property taxes and a modest living for his family were his only major expenses. He watched his neighbors, good men who had worked hard their whole lives, get swept away. He saw the stress etched on their faces at the co-op, the hollow look in their eyes. There was no joy in being right. There was only a profound, aching sadness. On the day of the auction, Frank drove his old pickup to the Peterson place. The yard was filled with trucks. Farmers stood in small, quiet groups, their hands in their pockets, their faces grim. They weren't there as vultures. They were there to bear witness, to pay their respects. They knew it could have just as easily been them. The new, shiny equipment was lined up in a row, price tags hanging from the steering wheels like toe tags in a morgue. The John Deere 7700 Turbo, the 8630 articulated tractor, the massive disc and planter. These machines, once symbols of ultimate success, now looked like extravagant, foolish monuments to a forgotten dream. They sold for pennies on the dollar, their value erased by the brutal math of the new economy. Frank saw Rich standing near the house, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and drawn. He looked 10 years older. His wife was beside him, her arms crossed tightly, trying and failing to hold back tears. Frank walked past the machinery and waited. The auctioneer moved on to the real estate. The parcels Rich had bought during the boom years sold first, going for less than half of what he had paid for them. Finally, the auctioneer announced the last item. The home quarter. 160 acres with house and buildings. The original Peterson family homestead. The bidding started low. No one had cash. The banks weren't lending. A few tentative bids were made, but the energy was gone. The auctioneer tried to work the crowd, but it was no use. He was about to drop the gavel at a tragically low price when Frank's voice, calm and steady, cut through the cold air. He made a bid, a fair one, significantly higher than the last. A hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned to him. The auctioneer looked at Frank, then back at the crowd. "I have a new bid. Do I hear another?" There was only silence. "Going once. Going twice. Sold." The gavel cracked, and the sound echoed across the empty yard. Frank Miller now owned the Peterson homestead. He didn't go to gloat. He walked over to where Rich was standing, a broken man watching the dismemberment of his life's work. Mary, his wife, looked at Frank with a flash of anger, but Rich just looked at the ground. "Frank," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "you came to pick the bones like the rest of them." "No, Rich," Frank said quietly. "I didn't." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "This was your father's place. It should stay in your family." He pulled a piece of paper from his coat pocket. It was a simple rental agreement he'd had the lawyer in town draw up. "I'm renting it back to you. $1 a year. You and Mary stay in the house. You farm it. When you get back on your feet, you can buy it back from me for exactly what I just paid for it. Not a penny more." Rich looked up, his eyes filled with disbelief, then with a shame so profound it was painful to see. The man he had mocked for years, the man he had called a relic, was offering him a lifeline, an act of grace he had not earned and didn't deserve. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a single, jerky motion, as the first tears he had allowed himself to shed traced paths through the dust on his cheeks. Frank gave a slight nod in return, turned, and walked back to his truck, leaving the paper in Rich's trembling hand. In the years that followed, the story of what Frank Miller did at the Peterson auction became a local legend. It was told in the coffee shop and at the co-op, not as a story of financial victory, but as a lesson in character. Frank never spoke of it. He didn't have to. His actions had redefined what it meant to be a successful farmer in their community. It wasn't about the size of your tractor or the number of acres you farmed. It was about the soundness of your foundation, the strength of your word, and the depth of your humanity. The farm crisis slowly receded, leaving deep scars on the landscape and the people. Many farms were lost forever, but the community, leaner and wiser, endured. Rich Peterson, humbled and stripped of his ambition, worked the home place with borrowed equipment. He and Frank became quiet friends, an unlikely pair bonded by the shared trauma of the land. Frank continued to farm his own ground, never expanding, never taking on debt. He eventually bought a slightly newer combine, a John Deere 6620 from the mid-'80s, paying cash for it at another farm auction. But he never got rid of the old Massey Ferguson 300. He kept it in the back of the new shed he had built with the profits from the boom years. It sat there like a retired champion, its red paint faded, its simple iron frame a testament to a different way of thinking. One crisp autumn afternoon, years later, Frank's grandson, a boy of about 15 with grease on his hands and curiosity in his eyes, stood looking at the old combine. "Grandpa," he asked, "why do you keep this old thing? It's just a piece of junk." Frank wiped his hands on a rag and walked over, placing a hand on the Massey's cool metal fender. "This machine," he began, his voice softer now, weathered by time, "is not a piece of junk. This machine taught me the most important lesson I ever learned." He pointed to the simple set of V-belts that drove the cylinder. "When a belt breaks on this, you go to the parts store and buy a new one for $20. You can change it yourself in half an hour with 2 wrenches. He then gestured toward the newer combine in the next bay. "When a sensor fails on that one, a man with a computer has to drive out here and charge you $200 an hour to tell you that a part you can't see and don't understand has broken. The part costs $1,000, and it has to be shipped from another state." He looked his grandson in the eye. "It's not about new versus old, son. It's about what you control. That man in the showroom, all those years ago, he thought the future was about bigger, faster, more complicated machines. He thought I was a fool for holding on to this. But he was wrong. The future is about independence. It's about knowing the difference between a tool that serves you and a tool that owns you." "This old combine," Frank said, patting the fender with a final, affectionate tap, "never owned me. It cost me $15 and 3 days of hard work one time. The lesson it taught me, that was priceless. It saved this farm." The boy was silent for a long time, looking from the simple, honest iron of the old Massey to the complex, shrouded engine of the newer machine. He was beginning to understand. Frank Miller farmed until he was well into his 70s. He lived to see his grandson take over the operation, a young man who understood that the balance sheet was just as important as the yield monitor, a young man who knew how to weld and who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. Frank passed away peacefully one spring morning, leaving behind a farm that was not the biggest in the county, but was unquestionably the strongest. A farm that was free and clear, a legacy of wisdom and resilience, built on the stubborn conviction of a man who knew that sometimes the surest path forward is the one paved with old, reliable, paid-for iron.